now to remember those 10 words, and the very best way is to paint wild pictures in your mind. If you have wild pictures in your mind, you are much more likely to remember them, and by remembering them, of course, you recall them, and if you can paint pictures in people's minds, they are much more likely to recall that stuff than if you simply give them facts or ideas, much more likely to remember pictures in this way. So, rule number 5 says paint pictures and tell stories. Make sure that you get those pictures in people's minds in order to be able to get them to remember the things that you want to talk about. You know, most of our childhood, we learned our moral values through stories. We learned our religion through stories. We learned to eat cabbage through stories. As we grow up, we still love stories. If you watch television, it's watching stories. If you read a book, you're reading stories. We love stories. And so if you can get that message across to those people you're trying to communicate to, you're much more likely to get them to remember them if you can involve and incorporate stories. So, tell pictures, paint stories, very important rule. Another picture here I want you to leave you in your mind, because pictures are very powerful things. This is just a picture of my dog. It took me forever to get him to sit with a bowl in his mouth like this, I must tell you, for the photograph. Now, this picture on its own, it doesn't mean very much. It's just a dog there waiting to be fed, of course. However, where that picture does have some meaning is when you link it with this picture here.
Must have battled there.
Yeah, must have battled, you're quite right. So, that tells a whole different story. And pictures can be powerful things. I don't use a lot of pictures in my presentations, except when they're powerful. And that picture will leave a powerful message. You're not going to forget that picture. And by taking away the picture, you will take away the message. At least that's the idea. So incorporate pictures and stories into your communications if you can. Rule number 6 is to use emotion. Use emotion in your communication. Emotion is also a very powerful way to get messages across. You know, one area where most money is spent on communication is the area of television advertising. Television advertising is a very powerful way to communicate, and around the world, particularly in America, they spend billions of dollars in America researching what works and what doesn't work in communication, particularly in television advertising, because they need to know what works. It's very expensive. They don't want to waste their money. Excuse me. Now, what they do in all television advertising, good advertising, is broken down into two parts. What we see and what we hear. And those two things work in quite different ways, and they have a different impact on us. Let me give an example. In the convincing process, in the process of being convinced, we use our eyes and our ears and our other senses to varying degrees. Would anybody like to make a guess as to how important the eyes are, as a percentage, how important the eyes are in the process of being convinced? Any guesses? As a percentage? Sorry? 90 over there. Any other guesses? 30 here, 60. Any other guesses? It's actually, you're very close. It's 87. 87% of the convincing process comes through your eyes. Only 9% through your ears and 4% through your other senses. Now, I don't like to leave statistics without some form of proof, so everybody hold one finger up in the air, please. Hold one finger in the air. Very good. Put it on your head. Splendid. Put it on your nose. Put it on your chin. 87% of you put it on your cheek, not your chin. 9% of you put it on your chin, and 4% put it in other places. Now, that's what the convincing process is all about. You're convinced by what you see, not by what you hear. Now let's draw ourselves back to television advertising. Remember, you're convinced by what you see, rather than what you hear. Now, in TV advertising, they have two things to do. They have a picture and the sound, what we see and what we hear. In the sound, they will tell us all of the good, logical reasons why we should buy that product or service or whatever it is they're advertising. They tell us the logical reasons. But the pictures are almost always emotional. Emotions, not logical reasons, but emotional reasons. Imagine any car advertising, any car advert. The story, the words will tell you that it's an economical car, it's a safe car to drive, but the pictures will be almost always emotional. It'll be a lovely blue metallic car going around the bends up into the mountains, or it'll be up in the top of the mountain looking down at all the other people who are stuck in the valleys there sending up flares, or it'll all be emotional. Or that lovely Volvo advert. You know the advert where the little child sitting in the safety seat at the back? And the whole advert is focusing on the child who eventually falls asleep in the safety seat. They don't show you the car in the advert at all. They just focus on the child. This is just emotional. They know that emotions work, you see. 87% of what's convincing you comes through your eyes, and they know that emotions are going to be what sells the car. Not logical reasons. We don't buy cars in a logical way, we buy them in an emotional way. Advertising is like this, all advertising. If you, for instance, in disinfectant, disinfectant's horrible stuff. I'd hate to try and design an advert for disinfectant, because it's horrible, isn't it? You can't touch it. If you smell it, you burn all your nose hairs. So they don't show you the stuff. What do? In the story, they tell you that it cleans and kills 100% of all known germs, but the pictures are always a beautiful tiled kitchen, lovely young wife, two little children, baby playing on the floor. These are emotional things, nothing to do with the disinfectant at all. So when you buy disinfectant, you're pushing your trolley around Pick and Pay there, and you take a bottle of Domestos off the shelf, and you drive home with this bottle of Domestos. When you get to your front door and go into your house, what you expect to find inside is a lovely young wife, two children, a tiled kitchen. Because that's what you bought into. That's the emotion you bought into. You see, emotions are very powerful things. In the last advert I want to share with you are the Magnum ice cream advertising. I mean, the Magnum ice cream advertising got nothing to do with ice cream at all, has it? I mean, it's just purely emotions they're trying to sell you. That lovely one last year, this year's emotions I won't bother to go into because they are far too obvious, but last year, you remember there was the advert where the young couple was making out on the beach, and the lady sent the lad off to go and buy something, and he went and he saw two vending machines. One was selling ice creams and the other one was selling condoms. And he had one coin. Now who are they trying to kid here, really? It's pure emotion, you see. It's tapping into our emotions. If you want to tap into the people you're communicating to, use emotion. It's a very powerful tool indeed. Your emotions you can grab people's attention with emotion. You use emotions to grab their attention. In speech making, it's easier to, of course, you use emotion to grab people's attention. Emotions are things like laughter. You make people enjoy it by making them smile, making them laugh. They'll remember what you've had to say because they've had a good time. It's emotion. Or you can build them up. You can get them excited, or you can write powerful words to get people really motivated. This is using emotion. But even in your writing, even in your letter writing or any communication, you can still use emotion in that communication to get your message across. I'm going to give you an example. Some years ago, I was involved in a union dispute as a consultant. I was on the outskirts of the dispute, but I was involved, and I was seeing what both sides did, and it was a particularly difficult union dispute. The factory manager was an awkward person, very hard to communicate with. The union representative, interestingly enough, wasn't a difficult person at all. But the strike was going to go on and on. Eventually, the union rep wrote a letter to the factory manager. And in the last paragraph of this letter, he included this, and I'm going to read it to you. He said, "By securing the salary increases and settling the dispute, you will gain the trust and respect of the whole factory and the admiration of the management board. Now, think about that for a second. Which factory manager would not like to get the trust and respect of the whole factory? Which factory manager would not like the admiration of his bosses? And of course, all of these things are emotions. So you can build emotions into these things. And by building emotion into it, you are much more likely to be convincing. Emotions are very convincing things indeed. And whatever you're communicating in, if you can use emotion in that communication, then you're much more likely to get your message across. Rule number 7 says, listen. If you are going to be good communicators, you have to be good listeners. You have to be able to listen well and to listen effectively. Good listening skills, however, are not difficult to get. And what we're going to be moving on to now are really looking firstly why people aren't generally good listeners, because people often aren't. And then we're going to be trying to improve those listening skills. Let's see if we can get them a little better. Firstly though, why is listening difficult? Well, there are a few very good reasons why listening is difficult. Firstly, talkers get short-term rewards. I don't know if you've ever given this any thought, but have a think back. As children, when we were babies, for instance, the talker, the one who made the noise, got fed. If you didn't talk, you're not going to get fed if you didn't make a noise. So we get short-term rewards. At school, if you answer the questions on a regular basis, you get the short-term rewards. So talkers get those short-term rewards. It's the same in business. If you tend to be a talker, somebody who puts themselves out, talks a lot, you will tend to get short-term rewards, not necessarily the long-term rewards, however. But it's true, talkers tend to get instant gratification. So it's hard to listen because talking's better, it's easier for the short-term rewards. When we are listening, we think we know more often. And we tend to interrupt when we're listening because we think we know more when we're listening. So it's hard to listen. We think faster than we listen. Somebody, when they're talking, people talk at around, well, about 160 to 180 words a minute. You listen, however, or your mind will go at maybe 600 to 800 words a minute. So you're thinking about a lot of other things, not just the conversation you're having. So you will often, when you're listening, you'll often make notes or be thinking about what's for dinner. It doesn't mean you're not listening. It just means that there's plenty of other space in your brain for other things as well. So we tend not to be good listeners. One area, we tend, if we want to get, one area which is really very interesting in listening, we here in South Africa, we've got a great pastime. It's true of the rest of the world too, but we're particularly good at it here in South Africa. When we go to parties, I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but I'm a great people watcher at parties. I love to watch people, which is probably why I don't get invited so often any longer. But at parties, when we go to a party, we go with our best doom and gloom story. You know the one, we've all got one. The good one, about your mother-in-law's next door neighbour that was held up at gunpoint and they had their car stolen. We've all got a story like that. And so you go to a party with this metaphorically under your arm here, and you look around for somebody, you see somebody on their own, so you pounce on them, and you tell them your best doom and gloom story. And they will listen for about 10 seconds. But then they realise that their story is a better one than yours. So they stop listening, and they just wait for an opportunity to tell you their story. So you take a breath and they say, you think, oh, that's good. Whoa, you should hear this one. So then they tell you their best doom and gloom story, and you listen for 10 seconds and you realise, yeah, they're quite right, it is a better story than yours. So what do? Well, you make something up, of course. And then you wait for an opportunity to pounce and tell them your best made-up doom and gloom story. We drag ourselves down like this, but we don't listen for very long. We listen for 10 seconds maximum, and then we're always waiting to pounce to tell them our stuff, whatever we want to do. This is not the best way to listen. We need to improve our listening skills. We have to be a good communicator, we have to be a good listener. Have to be. And there are a few things we can do. few things we can do to improve those listening skills. One or two things. Firstly, listen actively. When you're listening, listen actively rather than passively. Now, the men are not very good at this. Ladies are very good at active listening. Fellas, we can learn from the ladies here. They've had a lot more experience of this. We can learn from the ladies. When ladies are listening, what they tend to do is they prompt the speaker. They'll say things like, no, really? Wow. Tell me more. They're very good at that. Fellas, we don't have a clue. I mean, we really don't know how to do this. But we can learn. We can learn how to do this. You prompt the listener to encourage the speaker, to encourage them to keep going. Active listening. When you get to the end of what you're listening to, one very useful technique is to repeat back to the person who's been talking what they've said, but using your own words. So you... Serious, yes. You prompt them, but you'd say something like, let me get this straight. Is what you're saying this? And then you'd repeat back to them what they've said using your own words, and they'll say yes, or no, not quite that, more like this. So you get that communication going, so you fully understand what's been said. So you prompt the listener, check for understanding. Be objective. Suspend judgment when you're listening. That's a tough thing to do, by the way. It's to suspend judgment because you're already making up your own mind. But try to suspend judgment to the end of what the person had to say. And in that way, you're much more likely to want to listen on, to see if there are other more interesting things that are being raised. Empathize. When you're listening, empathize. That means not sympathize, but get into their shoes if you can. Find out what it's like to be them. Empathize with them. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them, but it does mean that you're seeing it from their perspective. And you're much more likely then to understand what's being said if you listen in that way. Use positive body language when you're listening. Lean forward. Nod politely, smile, open your eyes wide, look at the person who's talking. So use those positive body language things to make them understand, to make them to get closer to you. And in that way you can demonstrate if you're listening. Now, when you're listening, you are in control. When you're listening, you can use certain skills to demonstrate that you're listening, but there is another very interesting question. How do you get people to listen to you? Because, you know, over the years, and I've been to, I can't tell you how many thousands of business meetings, and we, in meetings and often in arguments or in just discussions, we have this idea that in order to get people to listen to us, we have to speak first, we have to speak longest, and we have to speak loudest. That's the way we get people to listen. None of those things are true, interestingly enough, but that's the way we typically would try and do it. Speak first, speak longest, speak loudest, and then you get people to listen. Doesn't work. I came across an interesting example of this some years ago with my family. And this story was when my middle sister and my middle daughter was 8 years old. And